The descent from the Himalayas had begun with a strange lightness, a deceptive air of triumph clinging to the weary archaeologists. They had found it, the lost cave marked only by cryptic symbols on a tattered map passed down through generations of Sherpas. Inside, nestled deep within the unforgiving rock, lay a chamber untouched by time, its walls covered in intricate carvings unlike anything they had ever seen. But the triumph had curdled into a disquieting silence. One by one, as they trekked back towards civilization, their voices had vanished. Not a physical ailment, the camp doctor, a young and usually jovial man named Ben, had insisted after frantic examinations. Their vocal cords were fine, their throats clear. The words simply wouldn't come. Dr. Alistair Reed, the expedition leader, a man whose booming pronouncements had echoed through lecture halls for decades, now communicated only through frustrated gestures and hastily scribbled notes. Sarah, the team's linguist, whose insightful interpretations of ancient languages had been crucial to their discovery, stared with wide, panicked eyes, her attempts to speak dissolving into voiceless gasps. Even Tenzing, their stoic and unflappable guide, a man who had weathered countless Himalayan storms, wore a mask of bewildered apprehension. Only one of them, a quiet, meticulous researcher named Elias, seemed to have foreseen this creeping silence. He carried a small, worn audio recorder, and since their voices had failed, he had begun to speak into it, his hushed tones a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet that had fallen over the group. His entries, shared reluctantly and only when pressed by Alistair's insistent scribbles, spoke of a growing unease within the cave, a sense of something ancient and watchful. The wall, Elias's recorded voice had whispered, played back in the hushed tent, the static crackle amplifying the tension. It reacted to sound. When Ben coughed near it, the carvings seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. We thought it was dust, settling from the vibration. But then Sarah spoke, reciting a phrase from the inscription, and a low hum resonated from the stone. Not a sound we could hear with our ears, but a feeling. A pressure in the chest. We dismissed it, eager to continue our work. Foolish. So foolish. The journey down was becoming a descent into something far more profound than altitude. The familiar camaraderie of shared hardship had been replaced by a gnawing isolation. Each member was trapped within their own silent world, their anxieties amplified by the inability to communicate, to seek reassurance. The rustling of their gear, the crunch of their boots on the rocky terrain, the whistling wind, these mundane sounds now seemed unnaturally loud in the absence of human voices, each one a stark reminder of what they had lost. Alistair, his face etched with worry, would often stop, his gaze sweeping over the desolate landscape as if searching for an answer in the silent peaks. Sarah, usually so animated, now walked with a slumped posture, her eyes darting nervously at shadows. Ben, stripped of his easygoing banter, had become withdrawn, his medical knowledge useless against this inexplicable affliction. Tenzing, ever vigilant, seemed to listen to the silence itself, his brow furrowed in an unreadable expression. Elias continued to record his observations, his voice a fragile thread in the growing tapestry of their fear. He spoke of nightmares, vivid and unsettling, filled with whispering shadows and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. He described a growing sensitivity to sound, a heightened awareness of the natural world that was becoming almost unbearable. The chirping of birds felt like a cacophony, the rush of a mountain stream like a roaring torrent. One evening, huddled around a small fire, the silence broken only by the crackling flames and Elias's soft voice emanating from the recorder, he recounted the moment they had, perhaps irrevocably, crossed a threshold. Deeper within the chamber, his recorded voice recounted, we found a section of the wall that seemed different. The carvings here were not just etched into the stone, they seemed to writhe, to have a dimension beyond the flat surface. Drawn by an irresistible curiosity, Sarah began to read aloud the final inscription, the one that spoke of a sleeping guardian. As her voice echoed in the confined space, the wall pulsed with a faint light, and that low hum returned, stronger this time, vibrating through our very bones. It felt ancient, malevolent, like we had disturbed something that should have remained undisturbed. Alistair's hand trembled as he held the small recorder, his eyes fixed on the flickering firelight. The implications of Elias's words hung heavy in the silent air. They had not just discovered a lost cave, they had awakened something within it. And now, stripped of their voices, they were left to face the consequences, their fear a silent scream trapped within their chests, echoing the ancient silence of the mountains. The journey back had become a desperate flight, a silent plea for escape from an unseen pursuer, a dread that resonated deeper than any spoken word ever could. The second leg of their silent journey was marked by a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The initial bewilderment had hardened into a gnawing dread. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound, it felt like a presence, a heavy blanket suffocating their senses, amplifying every rustle and shadow into a potential threat. They moved like ghosts through the stark mountain landscape, their shared predicament forging a strange, unspoken bond of fear. Elias's audio diary became their only form of communal expression, his recorded voice a fragile lifeline in their soundless world. His entries grew increasingly unsettling. He spoke of a persistent feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck even when no one was behind him. He described fleeting glimpses of movement in the periphery of his vision, shadows that seemed to writhe and coalesce into vaguely humanoid forms before dissolving back into the rocks and snow. "I can't shake the feeling that it followed us out," Elias's recorded voice whispered one cold evening as they huddled in a makeshift shelter. "That thing in the cave. When the wall pulsed, I felt a coldness, a sense of awareness directed at us. It was as if we had opened a door, and something had stepped through. And now it's among us. I can feel its gaze." Sarah, her eyes wide and haunted, would often stare intently at the surrounding wilderness, her head cocked as if straining to hear something beyond the wind. Alistair, his usual authoritative demeanor eroded by fear and frustration, would constantly check their back trail, his gaze sharp and anxious. Ben, though outwardly trying to maintain a semblance of scientific rationality, couldn't hide the tremor in his hands as he meticulously checked their supplies. Tenzing, his face an inscrutable mask, moved with an almost preternatural alertness, his senses seemingly heightened to compensate for their lack of voices. One afternoon, as they traversed a narrow mountain pass, a small avalanche cascaded down the opposite slope. The roar of the falling snow and ice was deafening, a brutal assault on their already strained senses. But it was the aftermath that truly chilled them. As the echoes faded, they were left with an even more profound silence, a silence that seemed to press against their eardrums, a silence that felt expected. Later that day, Elias recorded a particularly disturbing entry. "The dreams are getting worse," his hushed voice recounted, the sound punctuated by his ragged breathing. "They are no longer just shadows. Now I hear whispers, just at the edge of hearing, sibilant and cold. They speak in a language I don't understand, yet somehow I feel like I do. It's a language of the earth, of stone and ice, of something ancient and hungry. And in my dreams, I see eyes. Pale, unblinking eyes that watch us from the darkness." The psychological toll of their voicelessness and the growing sense of an unseen presence was becoming unbearable. Paranoia began to fester. They would eye each other with suspicion, misinterpreting a nervous glance or a sudden movement as a sign of something sinister. The lack of verbal communication amplified their anxieties, turning simple misunderstandings into sources of deep unease. Was one of them somehow affected? Changed? One evening, Sarah frantically gestured towards a set of unusual tracks in the snow. They were large, vaguely humanoid, but with too many digits and an unnatural gait. Ben examined them with a furrowed brow, shaking his head in disbelief. Alistair pulled out his notebook, sketching the prints with a trembling hand. Tenzing simply stared at them, his silence more unnerving than any exclamation. Elias, recording the scene, his voice barely a whisper, spoke of a growing certainty. "It's here. It's real. We woke it up, and now it's hunting us." The realization that they were not alone, that something ancient and malevolent was stalking them through the desolate peaks, hung heavy in the silent air. Their retreat had become a desperate escape, their silence a vulnerability, and the echoing emptiness of the mountains now felt filled with the unseen presence of something they had foolishly disturbed. The psychological horror was tightening its grip, and the once promising return from their silent expedition was rapidly turning into a descent into a living nightmare. The oppressive silence that clung to the expedition now crackled with a new kind of tension, the raw, primal fear of being hunted. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the thin mountain air, sent shivers down their spines. Sleep offered no respite, their dreams filled with the sibilant whispers and unblinking eyes Elias described in his increasingly frantic recordings. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur, the desolate landscape mirroring the growing terror in their minds. Elias's audio diary documented their slow descent into paranoia. He spoke of Alistair's increasingly erratic behavior, the expedition leader's once sharp intellect clouded by sleepless nights and silent anxieties. Alistair would often stop abruptly, his eyes darting around as if he had heard something, his hand instinctively reaching for the ice axe he carried. Sarah, usually so meticulous, became withdrawn and jumpy, flinching at the slightest movement. Ben, his scientific skepticism battling with the undeniable strangeness of their situation, grew gaunt and constantly checking their surroundings with a haunted look in his eyes. Even Tenzing, whose stoicism had been their anchor, now carried an air of grim determination, his every movement suggesting a readiness for confrontation. "Alistair thinks he saw it," Elias's recorded voice whispered one morning, the sound barely audible above the whistling wind. "A fleeting glimpse," he says, "between the rocks. Tall, gaunt, inhuman." He tried to shout, of course, but only a strangled gasp escaped. "He's convinced it's toying with us, staying just out of sight, letting our fear consume us." The inability to communicate verbally amplified their terror. Accusations and suspicions brewed in the silence, unspoken and therefore all the more potent. A sudden cough from Ben would be met with wary glances. Sarah's nervous fidgeting seemed to some like a sign of hidden knowledge, a silent acknowledgement of something they didn't understand. The bonds of camaraderie that had once held them together were fraying under the weight of their shared, voiceless dread. One evening, huddled in a small cave for shelter, a fierce argument erupted, a silent, frantic ballet of gestures and scribbled notes. Alistair, his face contorted with fear and suspicion, pointed accusingly at Sarah, scribbling furiously in his notebook. "You knew. You knew about the wall. The inscription, you hesitated." Sarah's tearful denials, scrawled in shaky letters, did little to quell Alistair's paranoia. Elias, recording the scene, his voice filled with despair, spoke of the disintegration of their group, the ancient evil they had awakened tearing them apart from the inside out. The environment itself seemed to conspire against them. The wind howled like a tormented spirit, the shadows stretched and writhed into grotesque shapes, and the silence between the gusts felt heavy with an unseen presence. They began to experience shared hallucinations, fleeting glimpses of a tall, gaunt figure moving among the rocks, the faint scent of something ancient and earthy on the wind, the almost imperceptible sound of dragging footsteps in the snow. One night, Elias recorded a particularly chilling entry. "I woke up to find Ben staring at me, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes, they were different. Empty. He wouldn't respond to my gestures. He just stared." Alistair had to physically pull him away. Now they're watching him. They think he's been touched by it. Infected by the silence. The accusation hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable. Ben, ostracized and terrified, could only offer frantic, voiceless pleas of innocence. The unity of the group had shattered completely, replaced by suspicion and fear. They were no longer just fleeing an external threat, they were turning on each other, their silence breeding a terrifying internal chaos. As they continued their descent, the landscape grew more treacherous, the paths narrower and the drops more precipitous. Their exhaustion was immense, their bodies weakened by fear and lack of sleep. One wrong step, one moment of inattention, could send them plummeting into the abyss. And through it all, the silence persisted, broken only by the wind and Elias's increasingly desperate recordings, a constant reminder of their isolation and the unseen horror that stalked them, a horror that was now not only external but also festering within their own fractured minds. The silent expedition was nearing its end, but the destination was no longer civilization. It felt like a descent into madness and oblivion. The final stretch of their silent ordeal was a blur of exhaustion and terror. The once majestic peaks now seemed like looming specters, the shadows they cast twisting into monstrous shapes. The air itself felt heavy, charged with a palpable sense of dread. Elias's audio diary entries had become shorter, more fragmented, his voice barely a strained whisper against the backdrop of their desperate flight. The hope of rescue dwindled with each silent step. One particularly harrowing day, as they navigated a treacherous ice bridge, Ben stumbled. A collective gasp, a silent expression of terror, rippled through the group. He scrambled desperately for purchase on the slick ice, his eyes wide with panic. Just as he was about to slip into the icy chasm below, Tenzing, with a speed and strength born of desperation, lunged forward and hauled him back. The near-fatal accident served as a brutal reminder of their vulnerability, of how close they were to succumbing to the unforgiving mountain and the unseen entity that haunted them. Later that day, huddled in a meager shelter as a blizzard raged outside, Elias recorded what felt like a final testament. "I don't know how much longer we can last," his voice rasped, barely audible above the howling wind. "The dreams are constant now. The whispers. I can almost understand them. They speak of a hunger, an ancient claim. I fear it will consume us all. I pray someone finds this recorder, that they learn from our terrible mistake." But amidst the despair, a flicker of something unexpected ignited. As the blizzard began to subside, Tenzing, who had been scouting ahead with his usual silent vigilance, returned with a subtle but significant change in his demeanor. He gestured urgently, pointing down the mountain with a newfound intensity in his eyes. He then mimed the shape of a vehicle, his movements quick and excited. Alistair, despite his weakened state and lingering paranoia, seemed to grasp the meaning immediately. A road. Civilization. A chance. A surge of adrenaline, the first they had felt in days, coursed through the group. The silence that had been their tormentor now seemed to hold a fragile promise. The descent became a desperate scramble, their weary limbs driven by a renewed sense of hope. They stumbled and slid, their bodies aching, but the thought of escape spurred them onward. And then, through the thinning mist, they saw it, a winding dirt road, and parked beside it, a familiar jeep, its red paint a beacon in the monochrome landscape. A figure emerged from the jeep, a local porter they had hired for the initial ascent, who had been tasked with waiting for their eventual return. He looked surprised, then concerned, at their disheveled and silent state. Tenzing rushed forward, gesturing wildly, pointing back up the mountain, then miming a creature with unnatural height and long limbs. The porter, though initially confused, caught the urgency in Tenzing's movements and the palpable fear in their eyes. It took days, and the expertise of doctors in a nearby town, to begin to understand the physiological effects of their ordeal. While they never regained their voices fully, their vocal cords remained inexplicably weakened, capable only of hushed whispers. The oppressive silence that had gripped them began to recede. The nightmares lessened, the feeling of being watched faded, though the memory of the sibilant whispers lingered like a phantom echo. Elias's audio recordings became crucial evidence. When played for local shamans and elders, the descriptions of the wall and the feeling of an awakened presence resonated with ancient folklore, tales of a slumbering earth spirit disturbed by human intrusion. They spoke of rituals and offerings that might appease it, warnings against venturing into that specific cave again. The archaeologists, forever marked by their silent expedition, carried the weight of their experience. They returned to their lives changed, humbled by the power of the unknown. Alistair, though quieter, dedicated himself to studying the local legends, hoping to understand the ancient force they had unwittingly encountered. Sarah, her passion for languages undimmed, focused her research on the cryptic inscriptions, searching for clues to the entity they had awakened. Ben, his scientific rationalism shaken, found a newfound respect for the mysteries that lay beyond human comprehension. And Elias? He continued to record his thoughts and experiences, his whispered words a testament to their ordeal. His audio diary became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the delicate balance between exploration and respect for the unknown. They had returned, scarred but alive, carrying a silent warning from the heart of the Himalayas, a chilling testament to the ancient powers that lie dormant in the earth, waiting to be disturbed. The silence had nearly consumed them, But in the end, the hope for human connection and the unexpected arrival of help had pulled them back from the brink. The silent expedition had concluded, not with a triumphant return, but with a profound and lasting understanding of the terrifying power of the unseen and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable fear.